Okay, and I'm gonna spotlight Dylan. So, welcome everyone to an Indian Education for All third Tuesday. This is Indian Education across the content. And tonight we have Dylan Huisken from Bonner, and I'm so excited. I got to peek at his materials for tonight, and I'm very, very excited. So take it away, Dylan.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. So this is on centering Indigenous voices, which an incredibly important topic if a lot of the teachers in Montana who are not tribal members are going to teach Indian education for all authentically. So how do social studies teachers, elementary school teachers, from or even high school, middle school teachers, how does anyone in this state authentically teach Indiana for all? And I would argue that you have to center Indigenous voices. A lot of our students are Indigenous, and to let them know that the voices of their ancestors are valued and not just peppered in like this token thing that we're going to do to say we're being inclusive, but it's actually a part of a rigorous education on what it means to be a historian and think historically. Yeah, my presentation is on trying to do that as we teach, and we can do that by helping kids think through the resources that we as the teachers hand them, or to be critical of the teachers or the resources that are often handed to us, the teachers, like textbooks. All right, so I'm going to start off with a nice quote from Little Jim from the Ute tribe. This is from a meeting he had with Indian agent James McLaughlin, where they were being told, not asked, about allotment. And in this record that you can access, James McLaughlin keeps telling the Ute tribe, I am not asking for anything. I'm not asking for your signatures. I'm not asking for your permission. I am telling you that this allotment is going to happen. And the thing that keeps getting said in response to James McLaughlin is tribal members saying, well, we're going to say our piece anyway, even though you don't have ears, even though you're not going to listen, even though you don't value our input and aren't asking us, we're going to talk anyway. And so here's a good quote. I'm going to talk to you anyhow, even if you have no ears. This idea that just saying something and making sure it's said is an important act of resistance. It's an important act of being. And we as historians now can look at what is said to help us understand the past. So we should be thankful for when people put their voices out there, even if people in the room or with them at the time weren't willing to listen. And this idea always makes me think of the Vine Deloria book, We Talk, You Listen, which is a great book. But just that title always makes me think about, it's time to listen. When we enter the classroom, we shouldn't go into that. We shouldn't enter the classroom with preconceived notions of what we think we should hear. We should be open to hearing from new perspectives, and centering Indigenous voices is a way to do that. So I've kind of framed this presentation as a best practices framing. So when teaching any topic in social studies, or say you're doing a social studies lesson in an elementary classroom, a teacher should always ask, is there a primary source that goes with this? Meaning, is there a record from the time it happened, written or told by somebody who was there? Having kids read the primary source is not enough. We have to teach kids how to read primary sources and how to ask good questions when reading a primary source. A good resource on that is the Montana Historical Society's analysis worksheet, which I think they got from the National Archives, which is available. Let's see if I still know how to navigate Zoom really well. Here we go. Here, I have this link list that goes along with my presentation. So this written document analysis worksheet helps students do some heavy lifting before they even read the document or while they're reading the document. And it gets them to consider, why was this created and who was it created for? We really have to start getting students to think about primary sources are created for a specific reason. The person who wrote them or said them did it with a certain audience in mind, and that's going to influence how they wrote them. So just getting students to think about the stuff they're reading before and during their reading it will help them better understand the Indigenous voices they're listening to. And we should ask ourselves as educators, can an Indigenous voice complicate or complete a narrative? And often these voices can be the starting center of a lesson, and more on that in a second. But often using a textbook or a video, or you go through some slides, that's not enough to teach about a topic. We have to find a way to center an Indigenous voice that can either complete that topic or hopefully complicate it and get students to really think about themes of who writes history, why do people write history, what narratives get told, and how do I work through that as a clear thinker. So an example of this is Lewis in his journals describing his encounter with the Blackfeet, where he and his men ended up mortally killing two Blackfeet members. This is the last line in his diary entry from his encounter, where he says, "My Indian horse carried me very well, in short, much better than my own would have done, and leaves me with but little reason to complain of the robbery." So he's referring to the fact that he believes he was robbed. He is the victim of a robbery or an attempted robbery by the Blackfeet members he spent the night with near what he called Camp Disappointment. So if you take Lewis's word for it, he was just sleeping, and then suddenly he and his men were the victim of a robbery. So I typically have students read that diary entry from July 27th, and I just ask them, what's happening? What's happening in this document? And they say, oh, well, he's being robbed. His gun is getting stolen. His horses are attempted to be stolen. He's getting robbed. And that's them taking Lewis at face value. That's what he said. So that's what's happening. And then I throw in an Indigenous voice to complicate that. So here's a link to an Indian Country Today article that's actually based on a newspaper article that appeared in Great Falls called Untelling the Big Lie, The Murder of Two Blackfeet by Lewis and Clark Party. And then it goes into the perspective of Blackfeet elders and historians on the context of what happened to Lewis. And can you actually label it a robbery, or is there something much more nuanced going on? So students then read this and are asked to revise what they think happened based on what they're reading now and based on what Lewis wrote, to try to make meaning out of these two disparate sources. And I know this particular page is cluttered with ads, but I have students read it to complicate narratives of the past by using modern day Indigenous voices, tribal experts, tribal members, tribal historians, to complicate this narrative that he was robbed. So that's what I mean by going to a primary source and then complicating it with an Indigenous voice. Another best practice when centering Indigenous voices is using oral traditions. This is actually one of our essential understandings, of course, essential understanding number 3, which is that oral histories are as valid, can be as valid as written sources. And just because it's written doesn't make it more true or more verifiable. So origin stories, traditional values, descriptions of historical events can all be studied in order for our students to think about continuity and change within Montana tribes. So we can use social studies as an opportunity to remind students that the class really isn't about the memorization of facts, but discerning meaning from complexity. And oral traditions are a great way to do that. Of course, oral traditions were meant to be heard and not read. So if you can find a YouTube clip or an audio recording of an elder speaking, that's way better than having students read an oral tradition. And keeping in mind that if you wanted to make it more authentic by retelling it yourself, you got to keep in mind that it could violate the norms of a tribe by doing that. Who gets to tell it, when they get to tell it. These are norms established by tribes. And so you have to be aware of that before diving into oral traditions. But basically going to the source, finding what elders are saying on YouTube. And of course, OPI has a lot of resources and links of different oral traditions being told by elders on YouTube. One of my favorites, though, is the Lakota Way by Joseph Marshall. This is a written book, but he actually has an audio version available on CD where he tells some traditional stories, and students can then draw out a lot of historical lessons, but also character lessons from these stories. So using oral traditions is another way to use Indigenous voices in our curriculum and treating them as good historical sources. In Joseph Marshall's stories, for example, you can find a lot about how tribes used to think in times of desperation in the winter when there's not a lot of food, for example. Or one of his stories about where did the first flute come from? And you can actually learn a lot about the purpose of music and the origins of music in specifically the Lakota culture. And there's a lot students can learn about what it means to study history by listening to that story and considering the themes of that story and the details of that story. Another good best practice is to never treat native voices as distant echoes. So you only look at voices from the past, and they're recorded and they're static and they're never going to change. We should use native scholars and speakers and poets and writers, historians from the present. So modern day perspectives are rooted in history. And so the modern day perspectives of, I say, a Native American poet can be rooted in historical traditions, can be rooted in historical trauma, and they can help us understand why modern day perspectives rooted in history matter and how they shape us. And we can think about why the ways people commemorate history can actually be an insult to Native voices. More on that in a little bit. So here's one of my favorite quote from a modern Indigenous scholar, Elizabeth Cookland, who I believe died over the summer. So her death is relatively recent, but she's got this great quote about what we as teachers, what we as historians can do to do more justice to our society. So here she's talking about the commemoration of Lewis and Clark during the bicentennial and all the hoopla around Lewis and Clark. So here's what she says. Historians, therefore, should resist the Lewis and Clark hoopla and examine what their discipline has wrought and commit themselves to doing better. What needs to happen is this. America, too, needs to refuse to accept the rationale presented in these redemptive strategies of historiography. And when it does, it will be able to think of the original inhabitants of this continent as living and breathing and continuing human inhabitants of the West. That change and that new scholarship would provide a future for all of us. Great quote on how you can't just treat Native people as people of the past, this attitude that all the real Indians are gone. By using modern Native voices, you are teaching your students a message through the medium, meaning you are teaching them that it is important to value the voices of right now, the present, because they are continuing, living, and breathing voices, and they are not gone and they're not erased, and they are still inhabitants of the West that deserve to be heard. So there's a great reason why we should use modern day writers, poets, Indigenous scholars in our classroom to help students think through what they're learning. So a couple examples I have in my document here is I do have some links on how to use oral histories as valid sources from Daryl Kipp and Joseph Marshall to go back to that. But I have a great poem called Nickel for Your Thoughts by Joel Waters, a Lakota poet, on the Lewis and Clark nickels during the bicentennial. A great poetry where he's trying to figure out how he feels about the commemoration of Lewis and Clark on nickels and kind of the symbolism of the nickel in our culture. Great poem, very passionate poem about Lewis and Clark and their commemoration. Or here's a poem by Linda Hogan that is about the Cherokee removal, Choctaw, Chickasaw removal, and the Trail of Tears. And so a great poem from her as well. So using poetry when you teach about a subject, asking yourself, is there a poem about this topic? Is there a short story perhaps about this topic written by an Indigenous author? Okay. Another thing we can do to make sure students are making sure they know that Native voices are not distant echoes of the past is to make sure that you address the theme of erasure with your students. You got to counteract that assumption that no real Indians are left. And you can do that with stories of vibrancy. For example, if you're using a modern textbook, you can actually point out where Indigenous voices are authentically used in the textbook, or you can criticize when they are absent. So I just got a new textbook this year, and almost immediately it talked about how the Pilgrims encountered a wilderness. And I call wilderness the W word. This assumption that what the Pilgrims came to was a wild landscape that with no human inhabitants. Because if Native people were never really here, then they don't deserve to be recognized now as valid inhabitants of the land, as the rightful heirs of the land. And so a word like wilderness in the textbook is actually very troubling. And if you could actually point out to your students why that's troubling, or ask them why that might be troubling, that's a good thing to do. Because if you know your Pilgrim history, they actually built on top of an old Wampanoag village, and they knew they were building on an old Native American settlement. They remarked in their journals about how they knew exactly where they were building their village. There's an author, I think his name is Francis Jenkins, has a great quote that the first settlers in the New World didn't encounter a virgin land; they had encountered a widowed land. Because of the effects of smallpox spreading throughout the continents, well before the arrival of several European groups. You can counteract, of course, assumptions of erasure with modern stories by modern authors about vibrancy within the lives of tribal members. So I got lots of examples, of course. There's Thunderous by Ms. Broadus, Montana author. Good Luck Cat by Joy Harjo. And these are great to use with young children, but I will sometimes use these in my middle school classroom just to show students that assumptions of erasure are very harmful. Bow Wow Powwow by Brenda Child. And then here at Bonner School, we actually had a lot of great luck. We showed a documentary through Julia Sherman's Filmmakers in the School program. That's part of the Big Sky Film Institute. And Malia Kipp of the Grizz, the Lady Grizz, showed up to visit our school to talk about the film she was featured in with the director. So she actually came and hung out with my students, and we didn't even know she was coming. It was a surprise visit, but the questions my students were able to ask her really helped them understand a lot of issues and how to study history and think about history from an Indigenous point of view. And she was just an incredible voice for my students to listen to. So bringing in Native speakers, Native guests who really can lend a perspective that maybe students would never get anywhere else. And of course, compensating these speakers fairly is very important as well for their time. But that was a great example of something that happened to us last year, where here was an Indigenous voice bringing her perspective of growing up as she did, pursuing basketball as she did, and her perspective on the importance of history. It was great way to help my students learn about the importance of using history to understand the present and understand people from different walks of life. Okay. Another thing I'd like to talk about that deals with erasure is another thing I do with my students. Speaking of books that I read to my students, even if they're more geared towards elementary school students, I would like to share with you guys I can find it. There it is. A book I just found laying around. I think I got it out of a little free library at some point, and it was called Truckstown Thanksgiving. So I actually read this to my students to get them to think about erasure and why it's important to center Indigenous voices and seek out Indigenous sources. Because if you only let one side or one perspective tell a story, we do ourselves a great disservice to accuracy, but also we do a great deal of harm to people in the present. So I won't read this book to you, but I'm going to pick on this book for a second. It's called Truckstown Trucksgiving or something like that. And it's about the first trucks coming to Truckstown, and they obviously are dressed like pilgrims. And it talked about how they build civilization. They're scooping dirt. They're dumping dirt. They're mixing cement. They're making roads. This one's wearing a little hat with a buckle. This one's wearing a bonnet. They built, a settlement. And then here's a nice Thanksgiving dinner. And the first time I read this book, I just read it. I don't say anything. I just keep reading it. I keep reading it. I keep reading it. And Jack says every year we should have a trucksgiving race. Here are these 3 pilgrim trucks racing. And they still do it at this time every year. And here are the same 3 types of trucks now without the pilgrim garb in a modern day city. And that's the end of the book. And I read it and I ask my students if they caught it. And most say no. And so then I give them a copy of the book, a digital copy, this digital copy, and ask them to look at it again and say, well, what stereotypes do you notice? What myths about Native people in the past and the present do you notice? And that's when they start to look with a more critical eye. And I get all sorts of interesting comments. We have this fiery, slanty-eyed truck that has feathers on it. We have in there again, and my students will say a thing like, he looks angry, he looks threatening, he looks big and menacing. Or this one, a literal monster truck with 4 eyes, acting very wild with his tongue out, acting kind of crazy, out of control. And then, of course, and this was actually the first time a student said this to me, this student happened to be an Indigenous student as well. He pointed out to me these 3 trucks during the first Thanksgiving of the same 3 types of trucks during the Thanksgiving that people still celebrate today, implying that, you know, all the Indigenous trucks are gone. They're not worthy of putting on the final page. They're not really here anymore. They're gone. So this is a book that practices erasure. It's a book not published not that long ago that uses stereotypes about Native people being out of control or unusually large or menacing or threatening or angry or just, you know, different. They're just different in a very uneasy sort of way. And students are perceptive. They notice that kind of thing. And so if this kind of stuff is appearing in our children's books to this day, if it's still appearing, we can combat that as teachers by making sure that our students are getting books like these within the classroom. Okay, another good best practice of it centering Indigenous voices is rather than sticking to a traditional curriculum and then trying to pepper in Native voices as a supplement, which I would call tokenism, use Indigenous voices as the start of a lesson, as the foundation of an entire unit. Start with a resource that uses an Indigenous voice and then build a lesson based on that. So with my 6th graders, one of the first things I do is ask them, well, what is history? And what kind of records should you look at? And how do you record history? And what does it mean to record history? And I start with Lone Dog's Winter Count, which there's a link to that in my link page that you can take a look at. There's a whole lesson plan provided that goes out, that goes really well with this. But this is a good lesson in, this is a form of history, this Winter Count. This uses Native voices and it uses oral traditions. And I hope that it battles the myth that people without writing are people without history. That's a very important, essential understanding, or our essential understanding number 3 is really trying to combat that myth that people without writing are people without history. So using this as the foundation of our entire year, which is, what is history? What does it mean to record history? What does it mean to study history? And we use a Native American source and Native American voices to understand what it means to ask questions about the past, think about the past, and what does it mean to record the past. Another good example is, say, a common topic like bison. So often bison are referred to in the passive voice, like bison herds nearly went extinct, rather than an accurate description, like hide hunters nearly exterminated bison. So we can make history clearer by centering Native voices. We can make it more accurate for especially our elementary school age children. We could start with a quote rather than with a book that kind of passively mentions that they were almost wiped out. What if you started a unit on bison with a quote like this? Then the white men hired hunters to do nothing but kill the buffalo. Up and down the plains, those men ranged, shooting sometimes as many as 100 buffalo a day. Behind them came the skinners with their wagons. They piled the hides and bones into wagons until they were full, and then took their loads to the new railroad stations that were being built. And we've seen images like this before. What if you started with images like this, but rather than just focus on the images, you're centering a voice that's giving a lot more meaning to an image like this. Or here's a great one from Plenty Coup. I think back and tell you much more of war and horse stealing. But when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened. I have my middle school students analyze this particular part right there. After this, nothing happened. What is he talking about? He literally doesn't mean nothing happened. But why would he say such a thing after the buffalo went away? What is he really getting at? There's a deeper pain there. There's a deeper meditation on the significance of the bison going away, and how do we scratch at the surface there and get to that pain, and why is a statement like "after this nothing happened" make a ton of sense if you study the role of bison in tribal and plains Indian cultures. You can also see this reticence to talk about life after the buffalo if you read Beth Judy's Bold Women in Montana history book. Her chapter on Pretty Shield, the Crow woman, you also see that reticence to talk about the bison going away. It's too sad of a subject. Another way you can center an Indigenous voice is starting with things that kids wrote in school during the boarding school experiences, during this boarding school era. So we should be teaching our students about the boarding school era, of course. A good resource to start with is the voice of another student. I think all our students could highly relate to the raw honesty that can emerge in a student point of view, whether it's a poem or a letter. And even though administrators often read student mail or graded, student assignments, there's a great deal of power knowing that students knew that and yet still wrote what they wrote. So here's a poem. I think I found this on Twitter long ago from a Dene historian, about written by a Navajo Dene student. And here's the other thing I'd like to point out. I just went ahead and attached it in my sheets. Is this quote here by, let's see if I put it in here. It's from Brenda J. Child's book, Boarding School Season. Highly recommend that book. A student named Gaston writing to his mom. And he says to his mom, "Well, I'm going to tell you what they told me this morning. Of course, it isn't me alone. All of us, Truman, Norval, and myself. But I don't like what they told me. This morning, they called us in the office. First, they asked us why we don't make our beds. Heck, we always make them before we leave, but no use. After we told them what they ask us, they start talk about me. They don't like how I dress, handkerchief around my neck, poor jacket and all that, how dirty my clothes was. They told me this. Maybe you think we're going to buy you a new jacket. Well, I told them this. If you advisors don't like the way I dress, you can send me home. Boy, they sure got mad. That's the only jacket I got. I told them that too. So I don't like that, what they told me. I almost cried too. So please try to send for me. I'm willing to come back. If you can send nothing, go up to Dr. Nelson and tell him what I said. I want to get out of here soon. I also don't like it up here. It's no good for me. So do your best. You can him this paper. I like to get out of here sometime this week. Do your best, mother, please." So this attempts to have his mother try to pull him out of school, to do whatever it takes to get him out. This feeling that he's not being heard, he's not being listened to. They get angry with him. They point all these questions at them. He tries to say, "I'm honestly doing my best. I don't know what more you could want from me in this situation." It is such a fascinating letter of resistance and, of course, just raw feeling of an Indigenous voice, of a kid forced to be in an incredibly, incredibly traumatic and unfair experience in the boarding school. Another example of centering a Native voice is treaty violations. I think all students should read treaties signed by the Montana tribe of the area they live in. I think they should understand what treaty led to the removal or the allotment or partitioning of Indigenous land or tribal land. There's a lot of people do land acknowledgements these days, but I think it's extremely important that people be intensely aware of what was done in treaties to remove Native tribes from their homeland. But rather than start with the treaty, I would argue when we teach our students about treaties, we should start with an Indigenous voice, not just their signature on a treaty. So for that, I have more links up here. I have this letter from Charlo on farming in the Bitterroot and basically being threatened to the point of removal out of the Bitterroot, even after all the work they put into farming and all their efforts to show that they were following the treaty, they still get removed. And then you go back even further where you read Victor's letter to the territorial governor, Edgerton, saying he's trying his best to follow the treaty, but it's very difficult and he feels like he's being set up to fail despite all his best efforts. And then I have students kind of meditate on why these guys are so frustrated with the US government, all the evidence that shows they're really trying to honor the treaty, and then ask, well, what is it that they're trying to do? What are they trying to honor? What are they trying to follow? how are they still being pushed around despite the presence of this treaty? What did the treaty actually say that would lead to these two sources? So these sources are for anyone to use. I developed this one myself using several different sources. This one is on the Montana Historical Society website. And then here's a copy of the Hellgate Treaty that I eventually have my students read, looking for the promises of the treaty that would lead to the frustrations of Victor and lead to the frustrations of Charlo. And so that way students can aptly see just how their treaty rights were totally violated, totally disregarded, and just totally set aside once it became obvious that white settlers were more interested in their land than they were before, especially in the case of the Bitterroot. So I would encourage people to look at that as well. Finally, another thing I try to get my students to do is to try to center or think about the missing voice. When you're looking at historical sources, and this goes back to my first point about trying to complicate a narrative, we have to ask ourselves what voice is missing. And in some cases, we can identify what voice is missing, but we'll never be able to truly find that person's voice, not in a totally satisfactory way. And a good example of that is Sacagawea, who, of course, is mentioned several times in both Lewis and Clark's journals, but is often not given her due and is often talked about in extremely harmful and derogatory ways. And yet, I challenge my students to read a passage like this and ask them if they can find Sacagawea's voice, even though we've already analyzed why this is an incredibly flawed document. It's written by a man much older than her, from a different culture, from a different gender. There's so many biases. Clark's a slave owner. Clark has all these biases when he's writing about Sacagawea. And yet, can you as a historian try to peel back something and find the voice that Sacagawea really deserved to have in history, but never got to record herself? So here's the passage. He says, "The last evening, Charbonneau and his Indian woman was very impatient to be permitted to go with me, and was therefore indulged. She observed that she had traveled a long way with us to see the great waters, and that now that monstrous fish was also to be seen. She thought it very hard that she could not be permitted to see either. She had never yet been to the ocean." So it's interesting that I mentioned Charbonneau first, but when it talks about the logic behind why Sacagawea should go to the ocean to look at a whale, what the complaint is, and why she is in the right, and why she deserves to be, impatient, which I interpret to mean adamant, and why she deserves to be indulged, which, listened to in the end, is because of her logic here. She has traveled all this way, and for her to be only a couple miles from the ocean and not be allowed to go see the ocean after everything she's done is unacceptable. And here's an example of her putting her foot down, which, again, students would have to imagine this is a 16, 17-year-old young mother in a terrible relationship with this fur trapper Charbonneau, putting her foot down with William Clark, the commander of this expedition, slave owner William Clark, and she's putting her foot down. We can find the hint of a voice here. We'll never find Sacagawea's voice in a satisfactory way, though we can listen to a great deal of Indigenous scholars to learn a ton about her, of course, and get a very accurate view of her, I believe. But we can start to get students to try to find a voice in deeply flawed records, when in many cases, the point of these records was to hide that person's voice in the first place. Can we try to undo the intentional work of the record keepers by using their own records against them? I think this is a good example of that as well. Of course, a lot of these sources I've just developed myself over time. And so I just want to say, if any of you ever want access to any of my sources, any of my curriculum, all you have to do is send me an email, Google me, find me on Twitter, send me a line, do what you got to do, get a hold of me. I will share gladly what I have. If you're looking for a specific example of an Indigenous voice in a certain context, I've tried to cultivate a lot with the help of the Montana Historical Society so that we have a Native voice for nearly any topic you're supposed to teach in typical curriculum you'd find, say, in a textbook. So is there an Indigenous voice when it comes to teaching about the American Revolution and the Enlightenment? There is, and I have a few. Is there an Indigenous voice when it comes to teaching about the Civil War? Yes, there is, and I have a few. So please reach out at any point. And then another good practice for centering Indigenous voices is, as the teacher, as the educator, just read Indigenous voices of your own. Expose yourself to these modern day scholars and past Native voices as well to gain perspectives. It will help you deal with questions from your students, perhaps defensiveness from critics, and add nuance to your own approaches as well. So my winter break challenge to everybody, or whenever you watch this, expose yourself to a modern day and past Native voices in order to gain perspectives of your own. And so, some suggestions for me. I'm currently reading The Rediscovery of America by Ned Blackhawk, and it's a National Book Award winner. And in this book, Mr. Blackhawk is essentially arguing that we have to unmake the way we understand history and the way we've threaded the narrative of history in order to really see the ways that Native people were always a part of it and played significant roles that many historians have chosen over time to diminish and, of course, erase. An incredible book that actually asks you to do, in a lot better way than I am, to consider the Indigenous voice and the Indigenous perspective at the center of American history through a variety of topics, whereas before we wouldn't think that there's any Indigenous point of view to consider. When I meet people from other states and I talk about this idea, I just try to remind them that no matter where you live on Indigenous land. And there is a treaty that made it very clear that the Indigenous people were to be removed from that land. And it's important to teach that to your students and find that treaty and find the voices. And I think a book like this is a very palatable way for people to do that on their own and do that personal work of understanding that. Great book by Ned Blackhawk there. And then one of my favorite authors who I've already quoted, Elizabeth Cook Lynn, the late Elizabeth Cook Lynn, Dakota scholar. She's got this great series of essays called Why I Can't Read Wallace Stegner. And the subtitle is A Tribal Voice. So she's got great points of view on anti-Indianism in America, on the way Native people are diminished in popular culture or stereotyped or mythologized, both romantically and also derisively in, say, like a show like Deadwood or something like that. Okay. So that's all I have today. I have not been paying attention to the chat, so I apologize. And yeah, any questions or comments? If anyone could add to what I'm saying or share other great sources or complicate what I'm doing here, I would love to hear from people.
That was fantastic. The treaties, I was really hopeful that somewhere in one of our energizes, and so I reached out to the Indian Ed for All team, and I am hopeful to make it a challenge to teachers to, read a treaty. You've done that hopefully you've done that if you're a social studies or history teacher, but I think every Montanan should find a treaty and read it, because it's so eye-opening. And just important. I think it's really, really important. And, the Hellgate Treaty doesn't take that long to read. And actually, neither does the Fort Laramie Treaty. And I remember not being a history person, not being a social studies person. When I first read the Fort Laramie Treaty, and I read the difference about the commodities that the men were given and to what the women were given. And I just had all kinds of problems with that. And it was kind of eye-opening. So anyway, I think all people should read a treaty. The other important thing that I really picked up on was, whose voice is missing. What a powerful lesson.
Yeah, and to your point on treaties, I try not to ask leading questions to my students. I really try to avoid that. But in many ways, treaties were designed to fail. And so after I have students read treaties, I do ask them, could you go back and find instances or evidence that shows you that this is really designed to fail? This is
Mhm.
designed to be messed up by somebody, and that will then allow somebody else to say, treaty's out the window, it's not being followed, you know, throw it out, violate it, break it, it doesn't matter. These treaties are promises being made that no one can keep.
Mhm.
You know, I think of the so-called Dakota Uprising in Minnesota, where during the Civil War, of course, the U.S. was falling behind on its promises. Dakotas were going hungry, and that boiled over into frustration and of course violence. Um, so what promises are being made that just absolutely cannot be kept? Or
Mhm.
why promise that? You know, if you read the Hellgate Treaty, which, you know, if you skip all the geographical descriptions about this river and this line of longitude or whatever, you can skip over parts of that and you can focus on what kind of buildings are they going to build on the reservation? What kind of rights do tribes retain? Um, why put that in there? Why build this? What's the goal there? And so asking students to read between the lines, be critical of the treaty, and really try to move away from that negative stereotype that, oh, look at all this free stuff they're getting. It is not free, and the human cost is unmeasurable, incalculable for sure.
Do students ever wonder what language the treaties were written in, and if it coincides with the languages of the tribes?
Well, I do have them read out of the Stories of the Land textbook that by the Montana
Mhm.
Historical Society. There's a great passage in there with a quote from an interpreter who says, not something like, not 9/10 of what was said was understood, or only 1/10 of what was said it was understood. And so the Stories of the Land book does a great job explaining to students of all the cultural practices that would have been hard to translate or would have been lost in translation, and all the cultural assumptions on behalf of the US government that would have made the whole treaty process extremely convoluted. So this assumption that your chief speaks for everybody in the tribe, when in fact these so-called chiefs are really just great men of influence. They're rhetorical geniuses, they're great speakers, they're very logical, persuasive people who have a lot of pull and a lot of influence because of the moral example they've set as role models, as warriors perhaps, or as just great rhetorical speakers. So the reason so many people follow them is because they've made a case to be followed and people have put their trust in them. It does not mean they're not a president, they're not a king. Their signature does not intend that now every tribal member of mine will treat this like the law of the land and agree to it
Mhm.
and not break it. And so assumptions of what justice is, assumptions of what leadership is, the political structure of tribes, all these assumptions just really guaranteed that a treaty like the Hellgate Treaty would fail. And I think the Stories of the Land textbook does that. So if you don't have that and you're watching this recording, reach out to the Montana Historical Society. The digital copy is free and online through the Montana Historical Society website.
Awesome, thank you. So if I am a teacher who has maybe, particularly social studies and history, etc., and I've been through maybe programs that maybe cultural responsiveness wasn't a big focus of how to teach all of this. So maybe I come to Montana and suddenly it's making me a little uncomfortable that, like, my biases are suddenly, it's a place of discomfort. What advice would you give for um, teachers to address maybe some of their own discomfort with history, and what multiple narratives might be out there, and how to move past that discomfort to consider, authentic narratives from peoples of the land?
Yeah, great question. I mean, studying history, you're going to deal with discomfort. You're going to see the extremities of human inhumanity, and you're going to see some of the worst human behavior, of course, because these examples of bad human behavior make history because they have huge effects on people and on our world. And so, you know, it's really difficult to learn about real important history without feeling a great deal of discomfort. I think as teachers, we can help ourselves get through that by educating ourselves, seeking out resources, listening to voices, and then by reading enough and thinking through this stuff and really reflecting on our own prejudices or our own biases and how we're being confronted with them and what we're trying to expose ourselves to, then how do you help students get through that, and how do you coach students through that? I recently closed up a Holocaust unit with students. That is not an easy topic to learn about at all. And I've had to, of course, make myself extremely uncomfortable by reading a lot of different accounts of the Holocaust, reading a lot of novels about it, and thinking through it so that I can help students process that. I think ultimately as teachers, we're the role models for students, and what we spend time on, that's really the message we're sending them. All the lessons we teach, this little point here or this objective there might be forgotten, but they're not going to forget how much time you dedicated to slowing down, to giving something its due, to making sure something is
Mm.
communicated as important. So just slowing down and taking the time with resources, asking questions, but also really encouraging students to ask questions, and process their questions. And you can bring these discussions up in like book talks and, what's called, discussion circles, discussion groups, and share their questions with each other. You could do it like with an online forum where they're posting their questions, kind of like, like a chat board.
Mhm.
But really modeling to your students the fact that, okay, I'm going to be cheesy. I say this a lot. If you're gonna be able to fight for your future, you have to learn to wrestle with the past. I don't see how people with any fortitude or clarity of mind can like struggle for good things in our future if they've never struggled with any uncomfortable things within our past. And so, you talk about all the unpleasant feelings that often students might feel. And I know this is a big conversation piece in the so-called culture wars that, by studying this or studying that, students are going to feel guilt or they're going to feel bad. And I try to tell students, you don't need to personally feel guilt for this, but you should feel a responsibility. So it's hard to thread this with some middle school students of mine, but you're not responsible for what people in the past did. You weren't there, but you do have a responsibility for what happened in the past in learning from it, doing better. To break it down for students who really struggle with this concept, I just say, you don't need to feel bad. You just need to do better. And you can't do better if you're sitting there with your fingers in your ears or you're looking away, because this conflicts with a narrative you've had in your head, a preconceived notion you came into the classroom with. So helping kids get over that hurdle of, this is not about just criticizing something for the sake of being critical, or just pointing out something negative to dwell on the negative thing. It is being accurate and clear-minded with our history so that we can be accurate and clear-minded with the decisions of our present and then into our future. And so there's no reason to get wrapped up in feelings of discomfort and guilt when we can instead start to see how this information is empowering. It's empowering in our own lives and how we treat others, and in the decisions we make going forward as communities, as neighbors, as a group of people in our state and in our country. So it's, I don't know, you have to teach students to be okay with that discomfort, and being modeling to them that this is something they can get through with a good deal of study and thought, and by using their voice and talking to others, and of course by listening to perspectives they would not have otherwise listened to.
That's an excellent articulate answer. Thank you. Do you feel that you have grown and changed as a teacher during your tenure from narratives and stories that you've added to your experience?
Yeah, originally, I only used native voices that were easy to find. So if a textbook provided one, I used that one. And if it was just one that many, many people were familiar with, say a speech by Tecumseh or by Joseph Brant, it's kind of referenced in a textbook, so I look it up on the internet or something like that. Basically, if it was easy to find, I used it. And I've really learned how to just seek out sources. And then in a book like The Bold Women of Montana History, I look at the sources of the author. So when they write their story about somebody, what sources are they referencing? And then trying to find those sources. Using the Montana Historical Society has really helped me out, of course. So, but just by seeking out Native authors, like Brenda Child's a great example. She's got that great book, Bow Wow, Pow Wow, but she's got an incredibly great academic book called Boarding School Seasons. And then you just look at what she's quoting, what schools she's quoting from, and what schools, boarding schools she's studying. And if you looked up more histories on that school, would you find more student voices? And so it's just about me keeping my ear to the ground a little bit and looking into the sources of the sources I find. And then of course, just I beg, borrow, and steal what I can. When I see it out there, I try to find it. And yeah, so I think to do this well, if you're new and overwhelmed as a teacher to this, I think it's you reach out to people that can help you. So use the OPI resources, reach out to somebody in your building who you think's doing it well. Email somebody. And if you're watching this, email me, I'll help you. So yeah, I mean, it's taken time. I've built up a collection over time. I didn't do it in a year. I didn't do very many things well at all my first couple of years of teaching, and I stuck to what was easy and convenient because I was overwhelmed. So it takes time for sure, but there's no need for every teacher to try to just figure it out on their own when they can lean on the people at OPI, in the Indian Ed for All department, or PLCs throughout the state, the Montana Historical Society, or emailing somebody who has offered their help. And I am currently offering my help to anyone who wants it. So.
Well, that is fabulous. I'll make sure that your email and your resources are in the description for the video. And I thank you so much for all of this. If anyone has any questions, feel free to, I'm going to stop the recording now.